All right. Thanks for tuning in here. This is going to be the introduction to Module 2. This is going to be our run from October 3rd to October 23rd. And as you can see from the title here, we're looking at essentially what are the underpinnings of what counts for teaching today. What is it that explains why and how you teach the way you do? So in this presentation, we're going to do two things. One is I'm just going to go over sort of the underlying research base, set you up to do the readings and the responses for the module, and then I'll overview what each of those pieces are. So take a second just to read these objectives. Again, my real goal here is really to sort of situate the research and theory that underlines literacy and language acquisition and related to your classroom practice. So in this case, there's lots of things we could focus on in this module. We're going to focus more specifically on comprehension, and it's particularly what the what the research says about instructional responses to it. So know that when we look at comprehension, we're not talking about the whole universe of literacy, but we're obviously talking about the end goal here, and that's why we're focusing on that, as opposed to some of the other pieces that I'm going to briefly overview in a minute. All right, so when we had our class discussion on Thursday night, one of the questions that we discussed was around this quote. So you'll recall that we had a conversation around what is meant by this and why Alvin and Emoji would say, most attempts to affect change in teaching continue to focus on the reader. And as we said, we focus quite a bit on identifying readers, particularly struggling readers, and quite a bit of our thinking is around changing readers, from low to high, etc. And we spend less time thinking particularly around the text that we select, the activities we do, and particularly the context of schooling or home, etc., in making those decisions to reform teaching. One thing to keep in mind, of course, and we'll talk about this in the next module, this was written right before this whole text complexity craze, so I'd be curious to hear what the two of them have to say around text's role currently. But I bring that up only because our theories are underlined by this idea about individual comprehension. We saw that in the RAND model, we saw that in their model, and we saw that in Kuser's model. What's happening in the brain is that idea is really guiding us in comprehension, and we can see the limitations in thinking about instruction. So, having said that, let's actually think about that. I want to show you something that many of you probably may not have seen, but will get really familiar really quickly. So I want you to pause this if you can and just sort of take in this chart. You might want to go from the top left corner to the right corner. And as you're looking at this thing, when you're trying to make sense of what the y-axis is, social support, mediation, think about that in the broadest sense of the terms. Mediation can include instruction. It can include working in a small group. Social support mediation is going to be any sort of like structured environment with the goal of producing learning. So that leads to this, and I'm guessing that some of this might start looking familiar to you, right? Now we see this idea about responsibility, the same chart with very specific ideas laid out. So you might want to take a second here and just pause it again, the presentation again, and just make sense of this chart. So we have this idea here of responsibility, right? And who owns responsibility. So it's starting to look relatively familiar. And you can see some of the pieces in here around the terms should sound something familiar to you. This idea about direct instruction, about modeling, scaffolding, guided practice, participating, right? We can imagine in that bottom right-hand corner, students are doing something independently, collaboratively as well. And so this is starting to look like the gradual release of responsibility model, right? Which is the sort of underlying model of instruction for at least the last 20, if not 30 years in classrooms. And you can see this is primarily based on this idea that at the beginning, readers need lots of support, right? In order to then be independent. And that happens over time. That because of social activity, because of instruction, this mediation from the teacher, because of that sort of activity that would then lead to the cognitive processing that would allow independence. And I know you guys have probably seen this I do, we do, you do triangle, right? That shows the relationship between teacher and student responsibility. And so that's this idea when we talk about sociocultural and cognitive, and we talk about where we're at in which it's neither one or the other, but both, this is this idea. It's sometimes referred to as apprenticeships, sometimes it's referred to as gradual release, sometimes referred to zone of proximal development. And this idea here that in a social setting, one can be trained cognitively over time to increase their literacy capacity and their independence. So that's one piece that's underlying literacy instruction, this idea that you can train people, you can apprentice people into understanding things over time through direct teacher support and through social activity, right? The cognitive and the sociocultural, right? So the other piece is in the first set of readings you're going to do around this idea of the ideas of the National Reading Panel. It happened in 2000. You're probably thinking by now, God, there's a lot of panels that happened around the turn of the century, and that was the case that there were a number of movements around reading research that shaped what you do in classrooms now. But this one in particular is the really sort of the defining piece, for better or worse, about what classroom instruction looks like now. This came out right at the turn of the Bush administration and deeply influenced No Child Left Behind in the process. And what this reading panel did was they looked at all of the reading research that had been done between 1970 and 2000 and basically tried to lay out what the evidence was for practice in reading. And the hierarchy in this report is that they said that there's 5 big panels of learning to read and reading to understand. And those include phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and then comprehension wraps around everything. And these 5 things are called the Big 5, and they really guide thinking around teaching and learning, even so much as that you can still see in the Common Core, for instance, in the foundational reading skills for K through 2, these pieces are exactly how it's laid out as well. So what did the NRP, that's the National Reading Panel, lead to? I'm just going to point out 3 implications of it. In your readings, you'll see in the Presley and Allington piece. I'll talk a bit about what was wrought from this. But one of the key findings you're going to see when you do the readings on the report is that there is a strong evidence base, at least according to their findings, for explicit direct instruction. And that is doing things like cognitive strategy instruction. In fact, coming out of this, they sort of identified 7 strategies for comprehension they thought would be effective. Systematic phonics was another big push that came out of this report. So this idea of doing direct instruction around language acquisition and comprehension was key. This report really reified the idea about reading at the instructional level. And if you're a secondary teacher not quite familiar with what that term means, it's a contrast with what we would say would be the grade level. An instructional level would be where the student is at in terms of their fluency, their comprehension, etc. I know that sounds kind of funny, but it's really thinking about the child's individual level, and thus this idea about just right books, about pairing the student with the text that meets them where they're at in terms of their capacity. And then, of course, there's this question about balance. And you're going to see Allington and Presley refer to it, and those of you familiar with balanced literacy get the gist of it. When we say balance here, what we mean is this idea between direct instruction and what's sometimes referred to as whole language. And that is, to what extent are we providing students with really explicit guidance in how to read very particular ways, and to what extent are we just merely exposing them to the activities of reading and allowing that sort of holistic whole language approach in which their interaction with text enables comprehension, enables enjoyment, enables goal motivation, etc. So let me just pose some questions that have come out of this that have racked researchers for many years, and that is, again, this is idea about to what extent are we teaching kids skills that they can sort of fluidly and flexibly apply anywhere, versus to what extent are we really hoping that they're going to read for meaning, and that is we're really emphasizing their experience with the text and the meanings and values they take about it. And I think one of the questions that lots of people have raised around this balanced literacy approach, around the National Reading Panel results is, well, what's the role of content or background knowledge? Because that wasn't focused on at all in the readings you'll see. To what extent does that play? And then a piece, if you're thinking about what Alverman and Moji are saying, is what role does context play? The classroom context, right? The home culture context. What role does technology play as well, particularly as we move towards more personalized learning? Okay, so there's going to be a bunch of terms. There's a lot of terms, some of which will be defined fully in there, but I want to point out some ones that it will not be. There's going to be some research terms. A meta-analysis simply is a study of studies. In other words, people gather like 20 or so studies that are on the same topic, say reading comprehension, and they come up with a calculation that allows them to compare the studies. In other words, you can determine whether an idea about like what's effective, and that's what they're going to do in the National Reading Panel. They're going to look at as many studies they can in fluency and say, what can we conclude about what's effective and not effective by comparing them? A quasi-experimental and experimental studies are this. An experimental study is where they did what was sometimes called a target and control, where one group of kids got an intervention and the other group didn't, and then they compare them. A quasi-experimental means there's just a single group and they got the intervention, i.e. a new reading program, for instance. You're going to see some early literacy stuff. Alphabetic simply refers to the learning of individual letters, the alphabet. Phonemes refers to the sounds that comprise the language, right? It doesn't necessarily refer to the sounds letters make. It refers to the sounds in language. So a good example would be in spoon, the oo sound is two O's. It's not necessarily a single letter. And phonics refers to the correspondence between letters and sounds. So in this case, the two O's, a kid could recognize that and be able to pronounce it as such. And then you're also going to see Kukan and Palansour refer to text-based discussion. And when they say text-based discussion, I want you to think a little bit more than just simply asking kids questions and them responding to it. They're referring to things much more structured, reciprocal teaching, Socratic seminar, etc., like a highly structured guided facilitation of learning through discussion of text. All right, really quickly, I just want to point this out. They use the same language, Kusser and Freebody. This was in chapter 1 and Kusser on the left. And Freebody, one of your readings, is going to do this on the right. And I just want to really quickly point out, there's this idea here about the 4 roles of the literate person. The code breaker just means understanding the text on the page. You can read it fluently, right? You understand letters, you understand how paragraphs work. Meaning making and thinking means you can grasp, you can comprehend what the text is saying. And then text user and text analyst are around like applying the text in situations. A text user will be able to participate in conversation, to respond in writing to it. A text analyst will be able to respond critically to it, understand its role socially or culturally, and critique it even. All right, so some key dates here in the module. I'm going to be moving quickly here. Your first reading response, I'm going to talk about in a second, is due on October 12th. The second reading response 4 is due on the 19th at the end of the day before our class discussion. Class discussion will be based on reading response 4. The POP lens analysis, which I'll get to in a minute, is due on Sunday, October 23rd, the last day of the module. And the group task is going to be due by October 23rd. Once you've read the Kukan and Palansour piece, you can do the group task at any point you want. All right, so reading response 3 is going to be based around 6 readings. All right, so it's going to be based around, and I suggest reading these grouped as I have them here. Read the National Reading Panel, National Early Literacy Panel, and Presley and Allington's response to them first. And then the next 3 sets are really all about comprehension and some different perspectives on looking at it. Freebody, Kukan, Palansour, and Beck and McEwen. I would read those together. And your reading response here is really trying to see what the connections are, the threads are between these ideas, because I really want to make sure we understand that. And I'll put together a presentation based on our responses for that. Reading response 4, they're all going to be around what do you think best practice is. So read Allington and Gabriel, it's short. And then if you're an elementary teacher, read Duke and Black only. And if you're a middle or high school teacher, read Goldman and Snow only. And reading response 4, you can also choose, you'll have an option, you can also choose the previous readings in the module too. Okay, your assignment for the POP this time around is going to be to apply the lens of course theories. I'm talking about sociocultural, cognitive, goal orientation. You're going to read about the situation model in Kukan and Palansour. Apply those to your POP. But the goal here is really to help you focus and expand your topic. And I really want you to think about, look at the directions and think about how you want to collect data. Do you want to observe in someone else's classroom? Do you want to observe your own classroom? Who do you want to observe? Do you want to look at student work, etc.? We'll talk more about that. Finally, I want you to just take a look at this really quickly. We're going to have in-person conferences after this module, but you're welcome to schedule a virtual conference with me. And the Pop Lit review, you're going to want to be thinking about